now time for a roundtable discussion, which will explore technology in conflict. I'm pleased to introduce as facilitator Chris Hunter, GNSI non-resident senior fellow and chief legal officer at IWP Family Office. Mr. Hunter has over 25 years experience in business, government, law, and education. He previously served as a federal prosecutor with the United States Department of Justice, Criminal Division, Fraud Section, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. Mr. Hunter also served as a special agent with the FBI. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Tampa and has been an adjunct professor of law at Stetson University College of Law and a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. I'll turn the discussion over to Chris, who will introduce the panel speakers, facilitate the discussion, and lead the question and answer session that follows. Over to you, Chris.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, as well as our distinguished group on stage. It's observing the obvious to say that technology has transformed conflict, but what is really happening now is how technology is transforming conflict continuously, nonstop, all the time, in near real time. Whether it's battlefield innovation happening in Ukraine, the emergence of a private sector in Russia that is like a defense tech sector in the States, and so much more. We already are in that future time where technology can be the tipping point between mission failure and mission success. And we couldn't have a better group of folks to help us think through not only what that means, but how to deal with it going forward. So let's get to it. I'm going to introduce each of the folks with me up on stage. Caitlin Lee is a national security technology expert at RAND, where she directs the Acquisition and Technology Policy Program in RAND's National Security Research Division. She previously created and led the Center for UAV and Autonomy Studies at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. She's been a featured expert at GNSI's At the Boundary podcast, which I highly recommend. And we're delighted to have her here in person. Sam Bennett is a Russian defense and technology expert at the Center for Naval Analyses in CNA's Russian Studies program. He previously worked at the National Defense University on emerging and disruptive technologies to aid the Department of Defense in responding to crises. Sam is a Russian military autonomy and AI subject matter expert for DoD's Defense Systems Information Analysis Center. And I can attest his expertise on these matters gets granular really fast, which is fantastic. Colonel Eric Andreessen. Eric is a colonel of Canada's Armed Forces and is Canada's senior national representative to CENTCOM, where he also serves as the coalition chairman. He has held command positions domestically and internationally, served in forward deployed areas of some of the world's most desirable vacation destinations, such as Lebanon and Afghanistan. Eric's presence with us today is especially significant because this summer he will be forward deployed to another vacation destination in Ukraine as Canada's senior national military representative. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Sam, and thank you, Caitlin, for joining us. So let's dive right into it. Probably the most visible, pressing, and compelling challenge and opportunity, which happens to be one that each of our panelists has deep expertise and experience with, is how drone technology and AI are changing air power. When we think about what we've seen on the battlefield in Ukraine, one of the striking observations is the way in which there's been battlefield innovation that's been happening real time on the ground. I'm curious, Caitlin, if you want to kind of set the stage for us as we think about how drone technology and AI are changing the air power.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. What we've seen in Ukraine is really a battle lab for thinking about how drones might change warfare in the future. And I would argue that it's really just the very beginning of that story, and that there's a lot of different technological advances that could even further change the character and conduct of war based on what we're seeing in Ukraine. Really, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And happy to talk more about that in a minute. But I think two or three of the main things that we're seeing in Ukraine is, one, Chris, you alluded to it, is this measure-countermeasure fight, this rapid dynamism and need for adaptation on the battlefield. That's something you really only get with the exigency of war, but it's something the United States really needs to be thinking about because we need to innovate quickly, even though we're in relative peacetime and we don't have that crisis situation to force innovation. We still need to be thinking about how to build up our industrial base and mobilize quickly and innovate. And so I think that's one clear lesson and clear dynamic happening in Ukraine. A second really important dynamic I think we've seen is the return of mass, as some people are saying it. So coming out of Desert Storm, U.S. and China, by the way, really focused on the performance of technology in that conflict. The U.S. was able to rout the Iraqis very quickly because of our use of information. We had information dominance through the use of satellites, and we also had precision-guided munitions. Those things allowed us to conduct rapid parallel attacks and annihilate Iraqi forces, command and control, and then ground forces with support from our own ground forces very quickly. Both the U.S. and China studied that battle and that campaign in great detail. And I've really focused on the importance of technology and precision to reduce the need for mass. So if you think about World War II, where it might have taken, literally hundreds of bombers to destroy one house, the introduction of precision-guided munitions means that you really only need maybe one sortie to do the same thing. And so really coming out of that conflict, you saw both the U.S. and China, the pacing threat for U.S. national security and for the Department of Defense currently, focusing on this need for high technology to substitute for large numbers of forces. But what you see in Ukraine is that mass is back in a big way. And when one or both sides has strategic depth, both in terms of the ability to marshal resources from their own homeland, those interior lines, but then also that industrial base, you get into an attrition dynamic where mass really starts to matter. And so I think that's a second big theme that we've seen emerge in Ukraine. And then the third thing that I would mention is just how drone technology has changed so dramatically. So if you go back to after 9/11, the use of the MQ-1 Predator to do sort of these loitering missions, combat air patrols over territory in Iraq and Afghanistan to support troops in combat and close engagements with Hellfire, but also do a lot of reconnaissance. And that was in very benign airspace. What you're seeing now in Ukraine and also some other recent conflicts like, in Syria, Azerbaijan versus Armenia a couple years back, is this much more contested environment. So you're seeing drone and different kinds of drones being used. So instead of these large military class sort of aircraft flying at 30,000 feet and occasionally dropping a few Hellfires on a high value target, you're now seeing these much smaller, cheaper drones, often commercially made, easy to use, being launched in large numbers with less lethality, smaller warheads, a grenade, an RPG, for example, just attached to a drone, but launched en masse to produce effects. And so I think these changes in drone warfare are really just the beginning. And I think you're going to see, for the U.S. force structure in particular, even more changes as artificial intelligence and new advanced manufacturing practices come into play. So those are just a few of the trends that I've seen in Ukraine that I think could really have some implications for U.S. and ally and partner force structure.
Sam, could you talk a little bit about the emergence of for lack of a better phrase, a defense tech sector within Russia in a way that perhaps is not dissimilar to some of the innovation happening on the ground in Ukraine by the Ukrainian side?
Prior to 2022, if you talked about the defense sector in a country like Russia, you would only talk about few specific companies. You would talk about the defense industry majors, and basically that's it. So they would be 5, 6, maybe 7 names top that you would mention. And most of the weapons that, for example, Russia used would come out of those defense enterprises. What is happening in Ukraine right now, in the Ukraine combat, and on the Russian side specifically, is a very unusual birth of an actual military private sector that was probably unimaginable years ago, and that has morphed itself despite of and in spite of whatever Ministry of Defense and the government is doing into an actual viable startup and volunteer ecosystem that is delivering weapons and systems, some of which that Caitlin mentioned, the tactical drones, a lot of electronic warfare system, and any related technology. So this happened spontaneously as a way to close the tactical capability gap that was very rapidly apparent within the Russian forces in the opening weeks and months of the war. And it began as volunteers cobbling something together, a group of people assembling something in their garage, in their home, and over time has evolved into enterprises now with national presence. So out of 1.4 million FPV drones that the Russian Ministry of Defense claims were delivered to the forces in 2024, the bulk of those are tactical small-scale UAVs, and a very large percentage of that number came from a lot of these volunteer communities and startups that now manufacture many tens of thousands or sometimes even hundreds of thousands of drones per month. And so this, again, exists in spite of what has been happening within the Russian government and outside of the official regulations. So these are technologies which are often unproven. They are not certified. They don't go through the official testing and evaluation, but it is those forces on the ground, the relationship with volunteers and startups from actually between the soldiers and these communities that enables this rapid evolution cycle where on the Ukrainian and Russian side, certain technologies can change every 2 to 3 weeks to several months. And so I'll give an example. One Russian enterprise that manufactures Ovid or Gadfly FPV type drone out of Tula. And the region of Tula is famous in Russian history as the weapons manufacturing region. This is a private enterprise that is now shipping drones to the front. It puts in a little piece of Tula gingerbread into the box where an FPV drone is located because the technology, as they claim, can change every 2 to 3 weeks. So if the box with a drone and a cookie reaches the soldier and the cookie is stale, it means it took longer than 2 to 3 weeks to be delivered to the front, and therefore the drone is no longer operational and has to be changed or updated and upgraded. So it is these type of efforts which are now aiding the Russian effort. These efforts are uneven. Again, technology is not certified, it isn't official. And so the Russian Ministry of Defense is taking very rapid steps to not just absorb a lot of these efforts, but to manage these efforts and to build a better relationship with the private sector, the actual defense private sector that did not exist in the country in February of 2022.
That's one of the perhaps now obvious but unintended consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine to its benefit is the emergence of a nascent defense tech sector that didn't exist just 3 years ago. And even over the course of the Ukraine conflict, it seems as though Russia was able to learn lessons not only from the drones that it imported, whether from Iran or from others, but also even from its adversary in Ukraine. One of the challenges that the mass presents and the rapid deployment of ever better low-cost tech presents is to the force itself and how the force on the ground is able to adapt in a time period that is really unprecedented. Eric, when you many years ago were doing some air defense work, the work that you did then compared to what air defense means today is night and day different in all kinds of ways, strategic and tactical. From a training and equipping standpoint, from a force preparation standpoint, how do you think about the ways in which we have to start doing some things differently to accelerate the pace of training for those who are going to be in areas where they're going to be on the receiving end of mass drone technology as well as on the delivering end?
Merci, Chris. Bonjour à tous. So I mean, the changes in my 3+ decades in uniform has certainly been significant. We've gone from fairly static installations, exquisite, extremely expensive systems, heavily manned, staffed, looking after mostly air-breathing air threats, which then morphed towards, because of the standoff distances, missiles, again, nowhere near the mass that drones are able to achieve, the close-in speed, the ability to launch them for very close to a target, which is causing a complete shift in the way we consider force protection, both to our troops and to the installations. So what does that mean looking forward? From a force generation, force deployment, force employment standpoint is how do we then ensure survivability? How do we compete when you can build a drone for very little money, but you have counter systems that cost potentially millions of dollars? And how do you shift that balance in the ability to feed something quickly and training that also needs to follow, and that is managed in a way that accounts for what seems to be an ever diminishing workforce. So all these challenges then pose a problems to the practitioners is how do you develop a system that is agile enough to counter that? Now, I would suggest that the soldier of today coming in is very different than it was 30 years ago. They're incredibly technologically savvy, and they come with already built-in training. I like to use an example of, I remember it would have been about 4 or 5 years ago, my son, who was just a young teenager at the time, they brought him some other kids, and at the base gym, they were having a game of laser tag. None of them had any kind of military experience, yet within seconds understood fire and movement principles, fell into formations, and knew all kinds of signals how to engage and destroy the enemy. So we're not starting from scratch. So it's understanding what these new soldiers come with, and then how do you link and provide the tools that allow them to be employed on the battlefield in a way that allows to deal with the new threats. So I think there's opportunity, there's challenge, but it's going to require a pretty significant mind shift from the institution that is not necessarily used up to now to move at those speeds. Thank you.
An institution that is not used to moving at speed is the Department of Defense when it comes to procurement. And so much of what we've experienced is now just table stakes, obvious. The procurement system has to move faster than it's ever moved before, certainly not in a peacetime, slow motion type of way, in order to not merely keep pace, because if we merely keep pace, we're losing, but to get ahead. So insofar as the training has to evolve rapidly, to what extent do you think that the modern defense industrial base, in partnership with the Department of Defense, can also rapidly evolve to a procurement system and thus a deployment of assets system that not merely keeps pace, but stays a step ahead? And especially when combatants in Ukraine on both sides have demonstrated an ability to rapidly innovate, rapidly deploy a good enough solution that can achieve effects. So much of the defense industrial base in the States is a knock on kind of legacy defense conglomerates. Is what we're experiencing now sort of innovation theater and we're never really going to get through it? Or is this the stuff that's going to break the calcified process and result in the speed of acquisition, speed of deployment that is necessary to deal with the challenges? Yeah, would love to hear the perspective of each of you.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of opportunity to ramp up the U.S. defense industrial base, and I think there's sort of two parts to it. There is the traditional industrial base, shipbuilding, aircraft manufacturing, but then there's also this really important software piece. So what we see in Ukraine for sure is that there's this constant iterative cycle of updating, and when you start to as you use software more and more, that updating becomes even more possible. And so software, computing, electronic warfare, these are all things that move very fast. These are all things the U.S. really excels at. And so I think there's really an opportunity to kind of merge those two sides of the coin, both the traditional, like bending steel part of the industrial base and the software part. I do think it's imminently possible. And I think it's just a matter of like getting the national focus on it. And it's encouraging, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Wicker, recently came out with the Forger Act, which proposes a whole series of reforms to speed up acquisition. And many of the things proposed in there may just require more cultural change than anything else. Like they may not all require legislative change. And so I think there's a lot of that's a good news story, because it means there's a lot of leverage there and a lot of opportunity to make changes in how we do defense acquisition without even rewriting law that could speed things up. And one more thing I'll say about it is drones So drones are by no means a panacea. Like, we still need artillery. We still need precision fires. We definitely still need, power projection assets. When I say we, I mean the United States, the U.S. military, because we have an expeditionary force structure. But drones do present some really important opportunities for the defense industrial base. And if we're concerned about ramping production quickly, I think drones do have some attractive qualities. And I think some of those include the fact that because they don't have a man in the cockpit, they don't need to be so they don't need triple redundant systems, right? Like, they don't need to have as much flight testing as a manned aircraft. There's also new manufacturing processes that we can start to adopt with drones. For example, maybe we don't lay up composites in little pieces. Maybe we start to use bigger pieces. Maybe we use advanced manufacturing. So I do think drones, because and their unmanned nature, does present some new opportunities to scale production, to move quicker, to reduce costs. And I think the bad news is we haven't really capitalized on that, but the good news is it's a huge opportunity. And 3D engineering, opportunities with digital engineering as well to drive down costs. So I think there's a lot of latitude there to improve.
I think Ukraine has showcased that the speed of innovation can actually overtake anybody's ability to comprehend the battle space in a way for them to have the full picture. That is, things can happen so quickly that you can only imagine a part of the battlefield and the technology used, while on the other part of the battlefield, the technology may be changing and advancing even more rapidly than what you have. I think I agree with Caitlin that it's a culture change. We didn't think of these numbers before the war in Ukraine began. We didn't think of millions of drones used every year. We thought in terms of hundreds, maybe thousands at tops, because United States has the advanced technology and overwhelming power to field its long-range UAVs with absolutely destructive force. But in Ukraine last year, in the Ukraine war, Ukrainian military fielded around 1.5 million drones. And again, Russia claimed to have fielded 1.4 million drones. So that's 3 million in 1 year. And this year, Ukraine claims that it can manufacture up to 4 million UAVs, and Russia will probably match that number. So how do you deal with these numbers? How do you deal with this innovation base that is demanding more and more resources? But this is also where we have to sort of essentially put an asterisk in our discussion, because a lot of the numbers are contingent on commercial technologies present and commercial technologies available. A lot of these UAVs and a lot of other systems used in the Ukraine combat actually come from the commercial sector, and they actually come from China. And so both sides are still relying on AliExpress and other Chinese online marketplaces to buy their essentially components in bulk for the assembly at home. And then, of course, both countries are now moving towards more domestic manufacturing, but still the reliance on imports in staggering quantities is still there. And that enables all of these numbers. So for us, we have to figure out, for the United States, we have to figure out what kind of acquisition we are conducting. If we are only relying on the domestic components base, then we're going to, I guess, talk in one set of numbers. If we're talking about manufacturing with allies, for example, we can expand the aperture and so on and so forth. But again, I think the conflict in Ukraine is rather unique because of the presence of commercial components in so many key tactical elements used every day in drones, in counter-drone systems, and related elements.
I would say so 3 aspects. First of all, partnering. So it's about partnering with industry, partnering with military, to ensure that it's the application of those technologies that are available to within an environment that makes sense from a military standpoint. The other aspect of it would be not getting in the way, so accepting risk. So not fearing the fact that we don't quite fully understand the technology, but let it progress at the speed of technology. I mean, as I used the example of my son earlier, he's studying computer science. He speaks a language that I don't understand, but once I let him explain it to me and he walks it through, then we find commonality in that. So I think that's absolutely critical. And the other part is it's defining the requirements. So as military practitioners, there's often too much of a tendency to look for that particular perfect solution that'll cover all the bases, be all things to cover all the requirements. We can't do that anymore. Technology moves at such a brisk pace that the right thing right now is good enough. I remember dealing with trials for a particular set for our forward observation officers. So it was a chest drop, had all kinds of functionality. There was so much in it that it quickly overwhelmed the operator, and we can't have that. So therefore, it's providing those requirements. Also, an important part is understanding the environment. So, for example, in Canada, increasingly concerned with the northern border. Well, when you're dealing with minus 40, minus 50, it's the same thing in Celsius and Fahrenheit at that temperature. It's cold. That makes a big difference in the application of technology, things like battery life and all that. So it is about that cooperation between those two elements. The risk, accepting risk, things like classification, over-classifying, and then finding ways to deliver those systems in a timely manner. And for the operators, the training, be agile so that the system that works now, 6 months later, you may change again. That's just the nature of the beast. So thank you.
We've talked about projecting power through drones, but how about countering the projection of power through drones? I think some, and I would agree with them, and the United States Navy would say that we today, the United States is at war off the coast of Yemen. The incoming fire that U.S. naval warships have to deal with on a routine basis from the Houthis is a level of activity that sort of meets the layperson's understanding of what it means to be, quote, right, at war. It's one thing to be able to repel that in a localized geographic area from a known force. It's a different thing to do that once the geographic area is broader, the opposition is more sophisticated, and the mass is even greater. How do we think about countering drone technology? Mindful also that the countermeasures to drones are ones that already exist and can be used to interfere with our own, when I say our own, our allies' use of drones to project force. So the dilemma that the technology problem presents, constant software as a service updates that are going forward all the time, nonstop, staying not merely apace but ahead to counter and to disable, so that the only solution is not merely, an expensive missile or a hail of gunfire from a naval warship.
I think, from the position of fixed infrastructure, for example, in the United States, we want to protect our own continental United States from air and missile attacks. And so I think it's important to have a combination of approaches and a layered approach. I think, it may be that there are some kinetic effectors that you want to have, but you also want to have non-kinetic effectors, whether you're using cyber or lasers or electronic warfare. You want to layer those approaches because different threats come from different vectors and have different effects. So you want to have that layered approach. Speaking specifically to a warfare context where you're actually you're maneuvering and you need to have that countermeasure in place, that's a really hard problem. Sam, you might have more thoughts on that. How do you counter those drones when the constantly updating?
Well, at the tactical level, it's a layered system, basically signals intelligence, electronic intelligence to figure out what signals you are actually monitoring, whether they're friendly or not friendly, electronic warfare jamming at all levels. And so Ukraine combat gave birth to the definition of trench EW, trench electronic warfare. That is absolutely portable systems that you can keep on you, that you can keep in the trench, attached to your vehicle, essentially something that the soldier needs nearby. Physical protection of different kinds, different levels. We've seen all kinds of physical means trying to protect tanks, armored vehicles on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. How do you actually defend your trenches, your dugouts, your fixed positions, your mobile positions? Finally, there's a lot of kinetic elements here, teaching your soldiers how to handle drones if everything else fails. And that involves all kinds of weapons and systems as well. But the number one element here is training. You need to train your people. They need to be aware. And another very significant element is information sharing. Units must share information with each other. Small units, large units, very large percentage of drones lost in Ukraine at different sections of the front is because of the fratricide with electronic warfare. You see something, you jam it, and then you figure out if it's a friendly or not friendly. So information sharing and training your people in different tactics and systems on a continuous basis is what's going to keep you, if not a full step ahead of the enemy, then at least half a step.
Agree with everything Sam said. I would add to, I think we're going to increasingly have to rely on automation. So both systems so that they can deal with the threat to have a man position. Now that also entails risk because there's increased risk then of fratricides. But we're just going to have to come to grips to that because to use General McKenzie's term, the democratization of drones just makes it that the sheer mass and volume of them is going to require a whole different approach. I would also add there's the question of survivability. So your command and control nodes, distance is one that comes readily to mind, or finding ways to, harden the systems or something. But it is going to be an ever evolving threats. And as mentioned in one of the previous presentations, if they know where you are, they'll find a way to kill you. So therefore, to expect some level of camouflage or that you will not be detected is probably highly unreasonable. So you either need some redundancy or need to be able to remove that capability from immediate access or within range of the systems out there. Again, is going to be a very evolutionary process, and that's going to require massive adaptation. But again, as mentioned, the use of automation, I think, is something that we're going to increasingly have to come to grips with.
I'm going to take a question from one of the folks with us today. How do we break the hold of legacy platforms, for example, missile programs and traditional defense primes that are threatened by UAVs? And I think we can sort of broaden that a bit, right? Because the theme to that question is a belief that the traditional defense contractors have entrenched economic interests, and those interests are so deeply entrenched that they're incentivized to, be sharp-elbowed, keep out innovators, and ultimately to the detriment of the national security of the United States and its allies. So breaking the hold of legacy platforms and traditional defense primes that are threatened by UAVs. Caitlin, you touched on this in your opening remarks or your earlier remarks to answer one of the questions about it's not an either or, right? It's a both and. We have to be able to do both. We can't just look ahead to a future of conflict that's characterized only by, drones spinning through the air, battling one another. Mm-hmm. But nevertheless, right, there's the challenge of being able to do both, being able to pay for both, being able to incentivize the development of the technology that can be deployed rapidly and continuously. How do you think about that?
Yeah. I don't think it's binary. I think the defense prime, like everyone can make UAVs. Drones are just airplanes with no pilots in them, right? So the defense primes all make drones. Smaller companies make drones too, and it's really more of a question of like, what's the right spread or mix across the different drone classes and types. And, you're going to need sort of military class hardware for certain missions. You're going to need to project power. You're going to need to go into contested and denied areas. You're going to start to need, different capabilities. You're going to need more, low observability potentially, a larger airframe that can carry a bigger tank because you got to go further, those sorts of things. And then for other missions, you're going to need something much more tactical. And so I think like when you're talking about those more military class systems, you may start to get into the primes where they have a lot of experience doing that. But there's also, as we talked about earlier, a lot of opportunity for, software. Software is becoming increasingly important, especially when you're talking about drones and as we move into more autonomous drones. And so I think that's an opportunity, software in particular, where you can start to see more competition. You can start to bring in other companies, non-traditional non-traditional defense companies who have expertise in software, who can really make a contribution. And really what would be awesome is if the DoD could move towards a model where you have a sort of an airframe, an unmanned airframe, and it's basically a receptacle for all kinds of software and sensors. And you could really just upload them at will. And then, because then you're really opening the competition space. You can have any number of companies sort of compete to do the software, compete to do the upgrade. And so you start to create competition that way. So I think there's some opportunity there to get the commercial sector involved, especially on the software side, but also on hardware. And I think the U.S. is starting to get better at drone manufacturing. As Sam mentioned, I think over 90% of the drones being used in Ukraine on both sides are made by China. The U.S. obviously doesn't want to be relying on Chinese drones or Chinese parts for their own military drone manufacturing. So we've got to fix that. And I think the U.S. is starting to move out on that a little bit, but a lot more work to do there. So I think there's definitely some opportunity, especially on the software side, but also on the hardware side as the U.S. gets its act together with domestic drone production.
I completely agree. There's space for legacy systems, and then there's space for innovation. We're not canceling the tank. We're going to have a different type of tank, just like General McKenzie said in his address. We're not canceling a naval vessel or a combat aircraft. We're going to see a different form and shape of these systems. And as General McKenzie said, we're going to see greater interaction between manned and unmanned systems in one form or another. So obviously, the defense primes have a lot of advantage in having the knowledge and the capabilities to manufacture technologies that worked before and are likely to work again. The speed of innovation that we're seeing in Ukraine, of course, is unusual. It is also owed to the nature of the conflict in Ukraine, which is specific and attritional and essentially where breakthroughs and large advancements are not possible at the time. But other conflicts may be different. Other conflicts may feature different combatants that United States will face, and they will have different levels of improvements in their militaries, improvements in technologies as a reflection of the war in Ukraine or maybe other wars. So we still need legacy systems because there's still no replacing a tank. The tank is still the king of the battlefield. But what shape and form the tank will take is under discussion right now, and this is what we're trying to figure out. Can these systems actually impact legacy systems? And what kind of defenses and evolutions should legacy systems have and go through in order to meet the challenges of the future battlefield?
So what I would add to the conversation, I think, so this is the world according to Eric, so please don't quote me. This is not a Canadian national perspective, but I think more modest militaries such as ours need to consider, maybe we need to move from a balanced force to a focused force. And what I mean by that is maybe we need to focus on systems and capabilities that we have, maybe a national inclination, be it through education system, access to technology. So for example, indirect fire, drone technologies, and that would provide a component to a broader coalition organization. And I think that approach would allow a better application of national financial resources to provide real capability on a battlefield without trying to spread yourself so thin that you just have snippets of different capabilities. Now, that can come off as very kind of heretic in some circles as far as, do I think that Canada needs a tank? Yes, I think a tank is required on the battlefield. Do I think we should be the ones providing it? Not necessarily. So I just offer that as, I think the future battlefield is going to require a different way to look at things. I think working within a coalition environment provides us an advantage to be able to do those very things and allows for country to focus their national efforts to something that they're more maybe naturally inclined to do so. And I think having at the very least that discussion presents both an opportunity and a more fulsome conversation about where we should direct those capabilities.
At the risk of using perhaps not a great example, as I've listened to all of you, I think about the F-35 and I think about the way that the manufacturing and development was sort of spread out intentionally among allies, some good allies, sometimes allies, and that was by design. And so, Sir Eric, picking up on some of the thoughts you just shared, the idea that at a strategic level, we think together about sort of highest and best use of capability from a system standpoint to have sort of that coalition approach to be able to, win the future, whatever that future looks like. How do we think about the ways in which we organize ourselves collectively to manufacture, produce, and deploy the type of technology in future conflicts that is necessary, rather than each allied nation sort of doing its own thing and ultimately coming together if necessary?
It's an easy question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, in a perfect world, everybody gets along. You sit down at a table, come up with consensus, and then come up with unified strategies. Of course, there's questions of national sovereignties, your own interests, or supply chain is going to become vulnerable. Do you want to generate some of the capabilities internally? So I don't have the answer to this, except I think it's desirable. Can we ever get there? That's a real challenge, because at times, for a number of different reasons, political or economic, we make decisions within the realm of defense that serve other interests. And I'm certainly not suggesting that they're not valid. I just think with the ever increasingly challenging global environment, that maybe we need to rethink this and look for those efficiencies that then allow us to deliver the right systems on time, to deliver the effects on the battlefield. And it's challenging. I don't know, but I think it starts with an honest conversation and asking ourselves, what do we want these coalitions to do, and what does it mean from a force generation and force employment standpoint? And I think once we've had those tough discussions, we can maybe come up with a framework that can work for all of us.
I'll pick up a variation of a question that came in from the group. Drones were the asymmetric tech in Ukraine, changing the course of the war. What is the next war's asymmetric tech? How do we get ahead of that tech, not just look back on today's asymmetric tech? And one of the first things that popped in my head when I read that question was something that one of my instructors at the FBI Academy in Quantico said, 20 some years ago, which is, as we were talking through the then new FBI case management system, the joke was yesterday's technology tomorrow. And, and that thankfully is a legacy of the past, but very much was the case. I mean, when I came into the FBI, our case management system, literally no joke, in 2003 was a DOS matrix-based system. That went away, but I trained up on that stunningly. When we think about the tech today, so much of the challenge is how to identify tomorrow's tech, so to speak. And I think part of that can also dovetail into a topic we've touched on, a couple questions have hinted at it, which is it perhaps not so much necessarily the new tech like a drone that we haven't really thought of yet, but rather, the role of humans in the deployment of the tech, the role of humans in the systems associated with that. Is that perhaps what the future looks like when it comes to technology and conflict? It also kind of picks up on some observations that General McKenzie made this morning about the evolution of not only our technology, but the evolution of our thinking about what to do with that technology to put it to its highest and best use in a threat environment that gets ever more dangerous, ever faster. And so thoughts on perhaps the role of humans as part of the evolution of what the future of technology and conflict looks like?
I think for the U.S. Defense Department, because there are so many challenges out there and so many different emerging technologies to choose from, it's really important to focus. And so one of the ways that the Department of Defense can do that from a force planning perspective is to really focus on a scenario and a set of operational problems. And once you identify those problems, you can begin to think about the kinds of capabilities that you need to mitigate or solve those problems. And then that drives you to the technology and what kind of game-changing, potentially technology you might need. And so to give an example, right now, the Department of Defense has identified China as the pacing threat to U.S. national security interests. And so if you think about the most sort of stressing, credible, and strategically relevant case for a conflict with China, it is over Taiwan. And so once you start to work through that scenario and think about what you would need to do to field a combat credible force structure that would deter China, then you can start to dive into the kinds of technologies you might need. And so that's a really good way, I think, to frame and think about, which technologies are going to provide you that asymmetric advantage. In a conflict over Taiwan, for example, being able to see the invasion force would be very important. And we know that China would immediately go after our ability to sense the battle space, both from an air and a space perspective. And so, are there certain capabilities we could use where we could overcome that and be able to see the battlefield, even if China's trying to deny us that ability? So that just gives you one example of the kinds of capabilities we need. And that can help you really focus down so that when you're sitting in the Defense Department and there's 50 defense contractors that want to come talk to you, you're thinking about a specific problem that you want to solve. I think that can be very helpful.
I think if we look at the official U.S. military doctrines and official documents and regulations, we're definitely giving a lot of space to automation, to AI, robotic systems, and we are trying to integrate a human into that rapidly evolving technological maelstrom. But also, I think what we have to consider is the human frailty and the human ability to make mistakes, even if there's a lot of information on the table, and human ability or inability to make the right decision given all the data that is present. And so we see this over and over and over again throughout history, when no matter how advanced a current technology is, there's still that human ability to misjudge something, misinterpret something, and make the wrong decision. And that decision can have military consequences, political consequences, and technological consequences as well. What do we invest in? How do we view the current market, whether it's high-tech market or the defense market? And how do we view ourselves relative to these factors? So I think that's going to be a constant, no matter how advanced our technology is going to be. If humans are still doing the fighting, as General McKenzie said, if humans still have to take to the field, then the human frailty and the human ability to make mistakes and make bad calls is going to be a constant.
So I would just contribute two things to this. I think concerns I have is, so taking the human out of the loop, that concerns me, and not that machines can't do a bunch of things quicker than we can. But I think, and I forget who mentioned it, but there's a presentation I heard not too long ago. So the equivalent of the human brain, the processing power to achieve that requires a 6,000 square foot computer to be able to do all those things that we can do both intuitively, but relying on our experience and a number of other things. So I'm concerned about that. Trying to find that balance will be critical, but taking the human out of the loop, I think, as we saw through history, with the advent of like strategic bombing, the fact that you could then further remove yourself from the problem, therefore dehumanizing the individuals at the other end, I think that is a very dangerous and slippery path to head towards. So I think we need to be mindful of that, the role of ethics within the process of conducting warfare. The other part is, and I know I'm drifting away from drones here, but is information. The importance, what seems to be the importance of timely information, advice, correct information. And we struggle with that as military practitioners all the time. Time to figure out the facts, time to figure out what exactly happened, who was involved, and this insatiable need to get that information back as soon as possible, even though incorrect. The timeliness is more important. That concerns me as well. And I think we need to give both these things a good hard think moving forward, because they both present significant risk. Yeah.
Is there a near-term future where the state of defense technology that's deployed on the battlefield requires humans not to be in the loop? In other words, we might want there to be a human in the loop. We might appropriately think through the ethical concerns of the absence of a human in the loop, but we also always must be responsive to conditions as they actually are. And again, sort of picking up on a theme of that prior conversation, if it's not so much sort of new tech, so to speak, but rather a new way that gets deployed in a in a conflict setting that is going to be ever faster, ever more complex, and with fewer and fewer people involved.
I think technology is definitely speeding up combat. You're already seeing it in Ukraine, where there's been reports, at least, that companies like Palantir are providing the Ukrainians with assistance with their targeting decks, and so targeting that might take hours and hours to do at sort of analog, where human beings are fusing sensor data from different platforms to mensurate targets. That can go down to just minutes with the help of computer algorithms that can sift through all that data and help prioritize targeting much faster. So you're already seeing in Ukraine how technology can really speed up that decision cycle for targeting. There's something called the OODA loop, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, which is this targeting process that forces go through. And I think we're going to really see that OODA loop continue to accelerate as technology advances to the point where we have, at some point, truly autonomous drones that can both have mission autonomy, where they can conduct their own flight paths, and then also automated target recognition, where they could potentially strike targets. And I think another driving factor is not just that the technology is advancing, but that there's a forcing function there, because our adversaries are also advancing with this technology. And so, to your point, Chris, I think there's a bit of an inevitability about the idea that warfare is going to be speeding up as these technologies advance.
I agree. And the speed of technology development is really something that we have to grapple with. And I think no one could really predict the Ukrainian battle space in February of 2022. We thought that the war would probably be fought and concluded on very familiar grounds and very familiar terms with respect to technologies and tactics. Yet here we are now, and we are now introducing more and more elements. So I would just say, I think it's difficult to make long-term predictions. We can sort of sense the patterns. But even if we make those predictions and we say we're going to have a lot of, let's say, automation, AI, robotics, we may not necessarily anticipate how this technology will evolve within a decade and how it will be used in combat, either by us, by our allies, or by our adversaries.
Agree. So I think rules of the game are important in this. And I think, technology will find a way, and we've seen time and time again problems that in multiple fields, they will find a technological solution. But if the rules aren't well understood and laid out, I think, again, to my earlier comments, we're heading down a very slippery slope. And I think defining what those are and making sure that those that transgress those rules are held accountable. And I think it requires beyond the military. If we think that these things, as we see the conflicts in Ukraine, is simply a military problem, it is not. And when we think it is nothing but a military problem, we're never going to solve it. Unfortunately, humans throughout history have found increasingly creative ways of killing one another. And the only thing that prevents that is giving those hard talks about, okay, what are the rules? What's acceptable? What's not acceptable? And at times choosing not to behave in the way that some of our adversaries have chosen to behave. So this needs to be front and centered. Ethics need to be part of warfare. If we devolve to a time or a place where technology is seen as the solution and just let it be, I think we take significant risk. But yeah, my 2 cents.
One of the things that could keep anybody up at night is exactly sort of really thinking hard through that future of, in some way or another, sort of fully autonomous conflict, fully autonomous warfare. One of the questions from the audience is, with regards to drone and artificial intelligence technology, what keeps you up at night? And for sure, trying to do the hard mental work of imagining what it means to have I think well before we're ready for it. A battle space that's fully autonomous in some respects is certainly one of those. But what keeps you up at night when you think about artificial intelligence, technology, and conflict?
I think it's just the idea that we know that our adversaries, especially China, are moving fast to adapt and to incorporate lessons from what we've seen in Ukraine. And as I mentioned, Ukraine's really just the tip of the iceberg. Like, we really haven't seen artificial intelligence come to bear in combat yet. So I think what keeps me up at night is just thinking about the form that takes and making sure that the United States is staying ahead in terms of developing a force structure that really maximizes the utility that we can get out of sort of automation and artificial intelligence, and making sure that we're keeping pace with the adversary and thinking about ways we can use the technology to our operational advantage.
I think there's a lot of twists and turns towards how eventual AI and automation can play out in the battlefield. Obviously, there's a lot of investment in those capabilities in Ukraine. There are a lot of attempts to create more and more autonomous drones. But at the same time, as these investments are made, Russians went ahead and attached the fiber optic cable to an FPV drone and became the first movers in a new type of drone tactic that is now gaining prominence on the battlefield. And we have to mention that this specific drone didn't actually come from a Russian defense major. It came from a volunteer startup community. The Vandal Novgorodsky FPV drone, which is powered by fiber optic cable, was actually a creation of volunteers in that sense, even if the technology and the concepts existed before. So we can invest in automated target lock and target recognition and the terminal guidance, and somebody can just attach a fiber optic cable to a drone and create a parallel development, which is just as effective and sometimes even more effective.
Yeah, if you could you just explain a little bit more what the significance of that fiber optic sort of quote innovation
right
means?
So if all communication, video, and other important comms is done by cable, then it's impervious to electronic warfare jamming. So you can't use electronic warfare to actually impact this specific type of drone the way you can with regular radio-controlled FPV drones and radio-controlled quadcopters from China or elsewhere. So these drones actually deliver very good video quality. They can fly quietly, and they can strike exactly where they need to. And so both sides are now investing in that capability. And the fiber optic cable spool, which is attached to the drone, has grown from 5 kilometers in range up to 40 kilometers now. So you can actually launch a fiber optic cable controlled drone far beyond the adversarial line of contact, well into their rear. But again, this was developed in parallel with investments in more autonomy and other AI capabilities. So we can have these twists and turns that we can't really predict quite yet.
I think I would say deterrence. The fact that deterrence doesn't seem to be working the way it did. We're seeing it certainly in the Middle East. We're seeing it with Russia and Ukraine. I think that's a real concern. It means there's a belief that maybe we're not going to come together as we had or were perceived to in the past, and I think that's important. As I mentioned earlier, the technology will find a way. It'll be a constant evolution, but the deterrence and the ability to compel your adversary not to act is front and center, and that needs to be reestablished. Until we do that, yeah, that would keep me up at night for sure.
Another question from the audience. Mechanization of militaries in the 1930s was initially perceived skeptically and as a fad internationally. How can our leaders avoid negative perceptions of emerging technologies such as AI or drones in order to take advantage of these developments? Certainly one of the challenges always is the information domain of the public and how that informs decision making, both the private sector and government. Hard to account for yet the impact on the public psyche, the public sort of information base about what technology in the battlefield actually looks like in a real war, right, in Ukraine, and how that may or may not accelerate support for and dollars for and demand for a type of approach to defense that overcomes inertia or overcomes resistance or overcomes thoughts of like, oh gee, that's just a fad. But that sort of that concept of sort of mechanization, militaries in the 30s, initially perceived skeptically. Plenty of folks can sort of look at technology and think, look, at the end of the day, that's not the ultimate problem solver. It's like so many other things. It's an enabler, but that's the extent of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of remains to be seen, and depends very much on the context how much of a difference any given weapon system will make in a conflict. I think drones have actually been around since at least World War II, in one form or another. It's just, again, simply like an unmanned weapon system, and frankly, the line between drones and missiles is like blurred almost to the point of being meaningless now. So it's just basically one more weapon system in the toolkit. I think the big advantage that drones have always provided is that they reduce costs. They reduce costs in terms of blood, because you don't have a pilot in the cockpit. Treasure, potentially, if you can bring the cost down of the drones so that it costs less than a manned aircraft, and political capital. So a really cool thing about drones, and we saw this a lot in the War on Terror, is that you can use them when there's sort of some ambiguity about who controls the airspace. We use drones a lot, for example, in the tribal areas of Pakistan, places where it would be really bad to have a pilot, a downed pilot, right? So those are some sort of enduring advantages of drones, that you take that human out of the loop and you can reduce some costs. So that's always going to be true. And I think that's become, if you ask me this question about like how accepted have drones become in modern warfare, if you asked me that question like 10 years ago when I was finishing my PhD on the MQ-1, I would tell you that like there's a lot of resistance to drones, even though they had a lot of success actually in the Vietnam War and then went away for a while. But I think that, the culture of the Department of Defense, but also just in the broader public, there's a lot more awareness about drones. I actually don't. I think there's a lot less resistance than there has been historically. And I would say in terms of, I have a lot of I am a techno optimist when it comes to drones, but I also think like it just depends on what you're trying to do. Like they're not a jack of all trades solution. It's not like all drones all the time. So I think it's just a matter of thinking about that context and taking them for what they are, which is a way to reduce costs.
I agree, but I'll also add that even if our leaders have all the information at their fingertips, they can still make their own decision. They can place the wrong emphasis somewhere. They can ignore certain advantages or disadvantages to specific technology. They may not be fully informed, or they may be fully invested in something else, while new technology rapidly develops and scales up and completely overtakes the leadership's ability to really comprehend the importance of this technology. So I think the human factor is still going to predominate, both at the tactical level and obviously at the highest command levels. So we just have to make sure that we give enough information to those who make those decisions and try to make the most objective and valid points and arguments about that technology and why it's useful.
Yeah, I would just add, I think the multi-use is something that could be leveraged. And I think, Caitlin, you mentioned about using different softwares, different payloads. I think that's an incredibly important point. The ability to go where people physically can't. As I mentioned before, us, the Arctic, we definitely see a lot of advantage. We somehow find it hard to get people to want to move up there permanently. So using drones is definitely useful. I think risk acceptance is front and center with this, because as Sam mentioned, that there will be mistakes made. So you can't be constrained by it. You have to accept that given the speed at which these decisions need to be made, the reality of operations using systems like that, you are just going to have to accept that some mistakes will be made. And I think that's a pretty significant hurdle to wrap our heads around, especially given that those mistakes will then be broadcast all over the world in very short order and then cause a number of unintended consequences. So I think those factors are going to make it quite challenging moving forward.
So an organizing principle of our conference is learning lessons. And as we move through the end of our panel to the final few minutes, I would take that learning lessons for future conflict and break it out into a few sort of sub questions, and then would invite you to answer any one of them. And so, for example, if I think about learning lessons for future conflicts, there are sort of principles that there are key questions that are embedded in that principle, right? What are the future conflicts that we envision? Right. The easy one is Taiwan, but what are the future conflicts that we presently don't envision that we should? Who are the lessons for? Right? So, U.S. and allied policymakers, military and intelligence community operators, right? The public, the private sector, and then of course, what are those lessons? And so, just thinking about how to wrap up a set of really complex topics into understanding lessons that might be applied to, or at least inform how we envision future conflicts, how we win in future conflicts, what lessons should be imparted to different constituencies.
So I think the lesson that maybe one of the lessons of many that we can draw out of Ukraine as the United States looks to sort of building up our military and ensuring we have the forces we need for deterrence is just this focus on the balance between precision and advanced technology and then low cost mass. We probably need to calibrate that for U.S. force structure. So it's not that we don't need, as Sam discussed, it's not that we don't need more exquisite systems with longer range, more payload. It's that we do need those systems, but we probably need to shift the mix a little bit to incorporate some of these lower cost systems that we can buy in mass. And I think that becomes important, especially when you're looking at adversaries who do have strategic depth and the ability to keep fighting. And I think it also becomes important when you think about the possibility that a conflict that you may plan for it to be a short conflict, it could easily turn, if it turned into a long one, it then becomes all the more important to have that ability to mass manufacture weapon systems quickly. So I think that's a key lesson, is getting that right balance between the advanced technology in U.S. force structure and then those lower cost, mass produced, quickly replenished assets.
I think a key lesson out of Ukraine is training and education. The technology can be there, the tactics can be there. Your adversary can actually use the technology and the tactics, but there can still be officers at all levels within the units that may not fully grasp the situation or not fully understand what it is that they're actually handling right now. And so doing that type of training and education, I think, is key, certainly for the American military, as it is observing what is happening in Ukraine and is trying to understand exactly how those lessons apply for the U.S. military, for NATO militaries. The training and educating your force in all manner of tactics and technologies that can exist and do exist, I think, is going to go a long way in forging a military that will be able to adapt and be adept when it comes to the rapid emergence of new technology, rapid scaling of new technology, and mass scale application of that technology in combat.
I think, the rate of expenditure, definitely from a Ukraine standpoint, of, as we've heard, ammunition is definitely a concern. And how does that play out then if you scale that up some more? How do you then sustain national supply chains, especially if you're depending on others to produce that for you? And I think the second part would be ethical consideration. What do you think is the acceptable use of military capability, under what circumstances, and where those red lines that you're willing not to cross? I think we need to give those a real hard talk, or think, especially with the application of technology, which again is probably going to remove the user from that direct sort of pinpoint, being the cold face of conflict. And I think that is something that we have not given enough thought. I'm going to add one more. I think the current procurement process is not fit for purpose. So we really need to have a good look at that, and seeing between industry and government, that cooperation, how do we accelerate that and getting the right technology at the right time. So those would be my lessons. Thank you.
If anybody's curious to take a deeper dive on that last topic, the book that I would recommend is one that Chris Brose wrote a few years ago called Kill Chain. It is, from my perspective, I think the Bible on this stuff. It's terrific. And to exaggerate, to make the point of sort of king of the world, I would take Chris's book and say, go implement this. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Caitlin. Please join me in thanking our panelists.